Hello and welcome to my channel. In the month of April, I dedicated my reading and watching to any book or film that was set within the American South. I've already posted my book wrap-up for the month, so you could check that out by clicking the link here, or I'll leave it down in the description box. This video is all about sharing the movies set in the American South that I got to this past month. So let's get into those. The first movie I watched this month was Interview with the Vampire, which is based off the book by Anne Rice. I don't know too much about this series, I haven't read any of the books, but after watching this movie, I'm kind of tempted to dive into it, especially if the other books are set in New Orleans like the first one was. This was kind of like a mood watch. I was reading Mina and the Undead this month as well, which is set in New Orleans, and the first portion of the book does a lot of like reference to Interview with the Vampire, and so it got me really tempted. I'm like, well, this is what my month is all about, reading books, watching movies set in the American South, so why not give it a shot? I've only seen bits and pieces of it growing up as I've like walked through the living room and my parents were watching it. As I was watching it, I really loved the cinematography, the atmosphere. The setting of New Orleans in the South, I think, is important to the story. Maybe not like crucial, but I think it is pivotal and utilized well as they're telling the story of those two main vampires. But I thought Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise really embodied these roles and their individual personalities that were definitely foils to each other. You have Tom Cruise's character, the iconic Lestat, that is very much like embodying all of the attributes of a vampire, and then you have Brad Pitt's character, Louis, that is very much in denial about the dehumanization that vampires do. Somebody asked me how I thought about this movie, and I kind of summarized it as like watching vampires whine about having eternal life, and obviously it's like more complicated than that. But I found myself later in the month like thinking back to this movie and really loving it. So that was kind of surprising, where I feel like after the fact, I was like, okay, that was like a good movie, super solid, loved the atmosphere. But then like days, even weeks later, I was like, should I read the book? I kind of really liked that. And watching Interview with the Vampire, along with reading other books that centered vampires this month, I'm kind of like entering my vampire era. It's very like high school for me, because I was in my like older years of high school when the Twilight series was coming out, and I went to all those like midnight showings when the movies were releasing. So it gives me a lot of like nostalgia, and I really like it. So I might be like totally on a vampire kick coming up here, so be on the lookout for that. So the second movie I watched this month that is set in the South is kind of embarrassing to admit that I have yet to watch it, since it's so iconic and classic in the horror genre and the horror world, and that movie is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. My biggest goal in 2023 was really to amend a lot of the gaps in my horror knowledge and exposure, whether it's books that are classic or iconic cult classic movies within the horror genre. This year is really all about watching those, reading those, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre was really high up on that list. Sadly, I was kind of disappointed by it. I feel like I went in kind of expecting a story, a plot, as well as characters that were similar to movies created around the same time, like Halloween. It's a movie you kind of just get dropped into, where you have this group of like young adults, probably like early 20s, who are on this road trip. I don't really think you get too much information on the backstory of the characters and like why they're even where they are. And it's super isolated, super desolate. I really love that vibe. They really use that Texas climate to its advantage, and it really created something super scary in its isolation vibes. That one scene where that one character approaches the really scary house for the first time was so shocking and so unexpected, super effective in really shaking up the pacing at that point. Like it went from 0 to 60 really quickly, and I really like the ending. Would wanted to have known a little bit more about the backstory of the characters, and maybe that's where I gotta go into maybe if they have prequels or sequels or any other kind of movies within this franchise that might help give me a little bit more context for this like OG movie. I think my biggest critique is that I didn't feel as captivated by the main character, the final girl, as I did for Laurie Strode when I watched the first original Halloween movie. I think because you have a lot of intimate settings that are part of Halloween, where you follow that young group of girls who are in high school as they go to school, as they're in their homes, as they are babysitting and doing like their part-time jobs. Like you really feel like you get to know them in personal ways as you are taken as the viewer into their personal intimate spaces. I don't think that was done as effectively in getting you to care about these characters, and maybe that wasn't even the point of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Maybe it's just to like rev up that chainsaw and do some really gross stuff. Yeah, I guess that's like the disappointing part, that I wasn't necessarily rooting for anybody because I didn't really know them or care about them. And I did a lot of research after watching this movie about the representation of one of the like main characters who was disabled physically, and possibly there's like an intellectual disability within there too. So that was something that really took me out of the movie, feeling like this character was constantly being degraded by people within their friend group. So it's kind of contentious. I did a lot of research about representation of disability within this specific movie. People are kind of two minds when it comes to the representation of disability within Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Some people really like that there are people who are disabled within it as a character, and then other people feel like characterizing this specific character as annoying and just kind of dragging people down and being like the fun sucker is a negative portrayal of disability that within a larger context at the time of not having anybody really disabled portrayed on film, especially not in diverse ways, it's just kind of like adding to stereotypes. It's actually doing more harm than good to have a character who is disabled given those specific kind of traits. The third movie I watched this month that was set in the American South was The Skeleton Key. I believe this movie came out in the early 2000s, and it really does utilize throughout the course of the film the setting of New Orleans in really cool ways. Like, talk about swamp vibes. This movie was a rewatch for me, and I hadn't seen it in a very long time, like to the point where I really forgot a lot of like the nuances of the story. Oh, I do know this movie was incredibly underrated at the time it was released. Kate Hudson isn't like one of my favorite actors, but I'm kind of neutral on her. I do like her in a lot of her comedic roles, but in this movie, she just rocked it. She was acting her butt off. When people look back at this movie today, many feel like it did not necessarily age really well. And the parts that they're referencing when they talk about that is hard to discuss because there are some spoilers that will come up. Basically, it all boils down to commentary regarding race, because largely the movie deals with racism, and so the major critique kind of boils down to whether or not the filmmakers, who I believe are not Black, I could be mistaken, if they made the right choices in trying to communicate the larger message that they were trying to get across. I thought it was really creative as a story, but then I also do feel like at the same time there was possibly some erasure going on when you see how things really unfold and the choices of characters, actors. Another critique people bring up about this movie is the exotification of hoodoo, which is definitely not accurately represented in this film at all. When I did some research about the movie, people did relate it to Get Out, which I also have not seen, and it's kind of embarrassing to admit. I guess a lot of the themes are really similar between The Skeleton Key and Get Out, and I think it's good to have a version of The Skeleton Key created by a Black person, considering that's the largest part of the message of Skeleton Key. The experiences of Black people historically in New Orleans and the inescapability of that history for the New Orleans community and just like the United States nationally. And that's what I've noticed about a lot of the books and movies I've read. Not all of them, but the majority of them set in the American South really have that theme of like the inability to escape the past and how you have to really face that head on. So as this is probably like one of the most controversial movies on this list that will have a lot of debate and a lot of opinions, I'd love to know what you think about The Skeleton Key down below. Another old school movie I watched this month was The Town That Dreaded Sundown, that came out in the early 70s and is actually set in the post-World War II era, which is like the late 1940s. The events that the movie portrays are actually based off of a real, uncaptured, unidentified serial killer in the town of Texarkana. So when it was released, it was marketed in a way that a lot of people in the community who had directly been impacted by people who were attacked or murdered took a lot of issue with the ways that characters were portrayed or like the marketing in general. And I listened to a podcast after watching this and was shocked to see how closely aligned the movie was to the actual events. There's one scene that I don't think is real, but it involves like a musical instrument in a death scene, and that was kind of wild. But ultimately, I did not really care for this movie. I was kind of bored with this movie. Mostly found the pacing to be super slow and the tone of the movie to be like super wacky. Like there were long scenes of comedy sketches that really takes me out of the movie because primarily I like horror movies, not comedy movies. I actually really enjoyed the podcast more than I did the actual movie. So this one was kind of like a dud for me this month. But a horror comedy that I think really nailed it this month that I watched was Renfield. I saw this movie with my mom because she really loves Dracula, Universal monsters, all that. She's the one who really bestowed this passion for Halloween and spookiness in my life. She is my spooky ambassador, so we went on a mother-daughter date and really enjoyed ourselves. I was worried because the major critique I heard was about the subplot line that has to do with the town of New Orleans. I thought that was enjoyable. Like, you really have to have something else going on, and I loved the metaphor that was like being bounced back and forth and developed. I thought the subplot line really complemented the issues in crisis that Renfield, the servant of Dracula, was going through and trying to figure out a lot of things for himself. I love that this movie did not have a romance plotline at all. I love the comedy in this. You saw a lot of like my favorite comedians in this movie. I love the silly gore aspects of this. Like, some people have critiqued it as being too bloody, but I didn't find that distracting. I thought it was funny because the scenes themselves, the fight scenes, are like intense and fun. I love the background music. I love the huge uses of like blood bags. As I was watching the movie, in my head, I was already thinking like, this is gonna be so much fun to rewatch. And I just like love Nicholas Hoult so much. April was a fantastic watch month for me. I feel like I got a lot of the movies out of the way that I've been needing to for a really long time. And it was awesome to be able to re-immerse myself in the New Orleans settings. I would love to keep these Southern horror vibes going. So please leave down in the comments below any recommendations for movies that are set within the American South that you highly recommend that I would like. And if you're interested in hearing about the books set in the American South that I read in the same month, definitely check out this video. I'll leave it linked for you here, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!